On a geological timescale, Earth changes very rapidly, so it shouldn't be a surprise that 385 million years ago, it was a very different world. Specifically, this time point has some very unique features, such as the overlap of 3 very different forests made up of very different organisms. This is the timeline of Earth, with all of its eons and their relative lengths. 385 million years ago is still the eon the Earth is currently in. However, the timescale of Earth's history is immense, so that's still way before the appearance of the first dinosaurs, which first appeared about 240 million years ago. Not only is this before dinosaurs, but it's also before land vertebrates. Despite this, there were still interesting land organisms at this time. Calamophyton is a tree-like plant that created a forest as early as 390 million years ago, one of the earliest forests on Earth. Although they look like trees, they weren't exactly trees, as their trunks were hollow. Calamophytons that were found were between 1 and 4 meters tall, so these were still unusually tall structures for the landscape present during this time point. Potentially some reached heights even significantly greater than 4 meters. Besides the hollowness of the trunk being unusual, its trunk was made up of many separate but still interconnected strands of wood-like material that were arranged in a circular way. These are called xylem. Xylem are one of the ways vascular plants can transport water and nutrients from the root to other parts such as leaves. The xylem on Calamophytons was starting to separate at the top, right below where the branch-like structure starts. That thing at the top didn't have leaves. Rather, it had a bunch of branches, sticks. This twig-like structure is also where the photosynthesis occurred. These branches were also shed by the tree as it was growing. It was shedding hundreds of branches, and with that, it was creating carpets. These trees did form a forest, so their density was pretty high. The larger ones were spaced out by 1 to 2 meters. These plants were mostly forming forests alongside rivers near the coastal areas, and they preferred sandy over muddy ground. They thrived in areas that were getting seasonally flooded. Although the fossils of these plant-like trees were found in the UK, back then these trees were located at a latitude 30 degrees south in the Old Red Continent, which is in the center of this map of Earth back during the Middle Devonian. This is approximately where the Calamophyton forest was located at. Although quite large, the Old Red Continent was certainly not the largest continent. That title goes to Gondwana, which was even further south. In fact, it was entirely in the southern hemisphere. It was pretty much a supercontinent. Both of these continents then fully merged later to form Pangaea. So back during the Middle Devonian, most of Earth's landmass was located by far in the southern hemisphere. That is the opposite of how landmasses are arranged today, where most of it is located in the northern hemisphere. 385 million years ago is considered Middle Devonian, and temperatures around this time point were about 24 degrees Celsius, much greater on average than they are now, which is about 15 degrees Celsius. Since Gondwana was typically further south compared to the Old Red Continent, with that it was also significantly cooler, especially inland during winter months. Snow was possible during winter at these high latitudes, but the overall extremely high temperatures just didn't allow for huge ice sheets to form. Although there was land right over where Antarctica is today, there were no huge ice sheets. There were potentially some smaller glaciers, especially because there were some extremely tall mountains back then. Probably some that rivaled the height of Mount Everest, and possibly some that were even taller. The Earth was in an active mountain building phase, but the Earth back then had a very drastic contrast in its topography. That is to say, there were huge flat areas and huge mountains as well. From the flat areas is where the greening of Earth was starting to happen as the new rivers delivered and covered the flat areas with mud. Mountains, however, were still likely very barren, and their peaks were likely very sharp as there was nothing to soften the terrain. With that, because there was no vegetation in high areas to soften the terrain, since vegetation slows down erosion, these Middle Devonian mountains had faster erosion rates compared to many mountains today. This is a map of Earth during the Middle Devonian. As we can see, the Old Red Continent, where the Calamophyton forest was located at, is part of the land that is today North America, Greenland, and Northern Europe. This ancient continent formed through the collision of what is today Northern Europe and Siberia, and a landmass called Laurentia, which included North America together with Greenland. The collision between Laurentia and Baltica formed the Caledonian mountain range, which stretched for thousands of kilometers and rivaled the Himalayas in both size and height. Potentially, it was even taller. There were also other huge mountains shown in this map of Earth. One of them in the Siberian continent, sometimes referred to as Angora Land. It was entirely in the northern hemisphere, a very isolated landmass. Gondwana in the southern hemisphere also had vast mountain ranges along with vast plains. However, most of the plains in the Middle Devonian were flooded because the sea level was much higher back then. So much of the dry land present today was actually a part of giant shallow seas. These shallow seas are showcased in this map. Because of the greater sea level, at least in huge part, Earth's land covered 15% of the total surface area. Today, Earth's land covers about 30% of the surface area. The huge shallow seas along with the high temperatures allowed for the formation of the largest reef systems that Earth has ever had. They extended over a much greater latitude range than today because of warm temperatures. It's likely that there were some stretching for thousands of kilometers, larger than even the Great Barrier Reef today, which is near Australia and stretches for 2,300 kilometers. This one is visible from space. Although the reefs were so large back then, there were no kelp forests. Kelps evolved way later. However, instead of kelp forests, there were likely places with large, colorful microbial mats. 385 million years ago is the time point during which plants were finally starting to colonize the land even far away from the coastline. Deep into the interior of the continents, there were low-lying flat areas with significant vegetation. River systems were transformed. Before vegetation, rivers were extremely wide and shallow. Their boundaries were unclear, and with a bunch of vegetation emerging, the rivers became more narrow and a lot deeper. They formed coherent meandering channels. Rivers started storing vast amounts of mud. However, one recent study found that meandering rivers existed before vegetation, suggesting that plants aren't the only factor that contributes to meandering. But it is important to note that plants still had influence on rivers. This was a period where Earth's surfaces were turning green, not because of grasses, but because of countless other plants. Grasses were still not present during this time. Potentially, even some patches of green were visible on Earth's continents from space. But this is very hard to say, as even with huge areas covered in vegetation, it is unknown if there was enough green to those plants in order to transform the look of the surface from space. First trees also started appearing on Earth during this time. Calamophyton does certainly resemble a tree, but on a closer inspection, the hollow trunk reveals that it's not exactly a tree. However, Archaeopteris is a plant species which has earliest fossils dating back to 385 million years ago. And this plant is what could be considered one of, if not the first tree species on Earth, and that's because it has a fully solid, filled trunk. Through growing, it also formed rings, just like modern trees do. The growth rings that this tree formed were caused by the changing of dry and wet seasons. It had branches very similar to modern trees, and it also had leaves that resembled ferns. However, they still differed in that, unlike modern trees, they did not have seeds. Rather, they reproduced through microscopic spores, which are typically single-celled without an embryo. So without a tiny undeveloped plant, and spores don't have stored food. Seeds, on the other hand, are multicellular, do have embryos, and do have food. Spores existed before seeds. The trunk of this tree reached up to 1.5 meters in diameter, and it was typically 24 meters tall. So these were typically as tall as a 7-story building. This tree relatively quickly became widespread all over the planet, or at least on every habitable land. These trees were most suited to wet soils, so near rivers and places where there is flooding. So these trees formed around 385 million years ago and then went extinct by around 320 million years ago. They were certainly there for a while, and they paved the evolution for later modern trees like conifers. These trees also likely massively influenced the evolution of many other organisms, as their roots altered the soil and its litter delivered nutrients to rivers. Possibly as a consequence, freshwater fish started to have quite a bit of variety. A type of lungfish called Dipterus was present. These were about 25 centimeters long. It didn't have real teeth, but something that resembles teeth. It had tooth-like plates, and just like their name says, they do have lungs and have to surface to breathe air. This allowed these fish to survive in waters with a low amount of oxygen and droughts. Lungfish are a transitory species to land vertebrates, but some species of lungfish are still present today. It is also important to note that all land vertebrates evolved out of fish that lived in freshwater environments, specifically rivers. Placoderms are an extinct group of jawed fishes that had an armor. Currently, probably the most widely known one is called Dunkleosteus. It was one of the first open-water vertebrate predators. It was also the largest animal during the Middle Devonian, reaching lengths of up to 4 meters and weighing up to 1 or 4 tons. Instead of teeth in their jaws, they had bony tooth-like plates that extended directly from the jaw. These bone plates allowed them to easily tear apart flesh and bones. Their bite force was likely much stronger than that of any animal present today. However, the problem is that Dunkleosteus was present a few million years after 385 million years, about 382 million years ago, which means that although the ancestors of this fish were present, they were significantly different in some aspect 385 million years ago. Eastmanosteus is one of, if not the closest known ancestor to Dunkleosteus, and they also achieved an impressive size of up to 3 meters. Giants for their time, but certainly were way smaller than the largest fishes present today. Back then, the fishes on average were quite a bit smaller. It is also useful to note that although true teeth were present at the time, they were not as prevalent as today. Eastmanosteus, just like Dunkleosteus, had a piece of sharp bone that was continuous with the jaw and extended from the jaw. That served the function of teeth, but they weren't true teeth. Still, during the Middle Devonian, there were some species with true teeth, such as Phoebodus, which was a shark-like fish that was potentially over a meter long. Many other jawed armored fishes were present 385 million years ago. Quite a few of them were not just saltwater, but also freshwater species. Bathyriolopus had a boxy appearance due to its interlocking bony plates, a very unique-looking armored fish. It had spike-like appendages. Although a bit controversial, it possibly had primitive lungs. They were likely detrivores, consuming decaying plant and animal matter. Although typically just 30 centimeters in length, some species reached the length of 1.7 meters. This species probably was present on all continents as well as the ocean, so it was a freshwater and saltwater species. Besides detrivores, plankton feeders were also present. Certain jawless fish were planktivores. The lack of jaws limited their feeding strategies, and they weren't good predators, so they frequently relied on suction feeding, scavenging, but also filter feeding. Jawless fish are vertebrates, but the jawed fish vertebrates were starting to heavily outcompete them 385 million years ago. With that, jawless fish were not able to achieve the sizes of jawed fish. They were rarely, if ever, larger than 1 meter, and were typically way smaller, but a lot of them were heavily armored. Today, all that is left of this once very diverse group of fishes is just lampreys and hagfish. Some jawed fish were also potentially planktivores. Holonema is potentially one of those. They had an odd shape which allowed them to traverse the seafloor very efficiently. They were bottom dwellers that reached lengths of around 60 centimeters. Their jaws and tooth plates suggest that they were planktivorous. However, they could have been eating other things alongside planktons. The chunks of rocks found in their stomachs suggest that they may have used rocks to aid digestion. This is something that even some animals alive today do. Holonema is a placoderm, so it was an armored jawed fish. This group of fishes is entirely extinct. Other groups of animals, like trilobites, were present 385 million years ago. They were on a decline during this time, but they were still surviving pretty well. At this point in time, they still have plenty of time ahead of them, but they are just past their peak diversity. Brachiopods were also present at this time just like today, so bivalves, stars, and sea lilies were also present. Horseshoe crabs, which formed way before 445 million years ago, were obviously still there during the Middle Devonian. This species is present even today, and it's largely unchanged. One of the most puzzling organisms that were still present around 385 million years ago is called Prototaxites. These first appeared at least as early as 420 million years ago and lasted until about 370 million years ago. They were a columnar multicellular organism that reached heights of up to 8 meters, and they were about 1 meter wide. Although at one point they were widely considered to be a fungus, it is still not fully settled that it is one. However, one way that this organism is certainly way more like a fungi and not like a plant is in that it is a heterotroph. This means that it cannot use sunlight to produce its own food like plants. Rather, heterotrophs absorb nutrients from the environment. Still, one of the newest studies on this organism suggests that it is an entirely different group of organisms different from fungi, plants, or animals. When Prototaxites first appeared about 420 million years ago, they were the tallest organism on land. There was nothing even close to their height. They were towering over plants which were a few centimeters tall at the time. However, 385 million years ago during the Middle Devonian, they were likely not the tallest anymore. The trees and other plants at the time were starting to outcompete Prototaxites in terms of resources, likely leading to their decline. Still, they likely were present around this time. Prototaxites didn't form dense forests. Although there were patches of land where they were prevalent, they were still significantly spaced apart. In some areas, there were possibly 3 unique species: Kelmaphyton, Archaeopteryx, and Prototaxites. They were overlapping in the area that they occupied, forming bizarre, alien-looking forests. Interestingly, it is sometimes claimed that Prototaxites were the tallest things during the Devonian, but the root system of Archaeopteryx, that is estimated to be about 385 million years old, stretches 10 meters across the soil. That root system was then used to estimate the height of the tree, and even the lowest estimates say that the height of the Archaeopteryx tree is significantly above the tallest Prototaxites. Prototaxites went up to 8 or 9 meters, while the estimated height of the Archaeopteryx tree that was present 385 million years ago is about 20 meters. So Prototaxites were very likely not the tallest organism during the entirety of the Devonian, but they probably were tallest during the earlier parts. Beyond Archaeopteryx putting into question as to what the tallest organism was during the Devonian, Archaeopteryx also further puts into question the now popular idea that sharks are older than trees. What we think of as sharks with their iconic characteristics weren't present until about 200 million years ago. At best, they were around 300 million years ago. However, what would be fair to say is that fish are older than trees. That certainly is the case. Still, there were potentially some shark-like species of fish 385 million years ago. Cladosolake is a fish that belongs to a group of chondrichthyans, which are fish that typically have their skeleton composed out of cartilage. Some very nicely preserved fossils were found even with intact kidneys and stomach contents. It was clearly a predator, potentially a very fast and agile one. It was up to 2 meters in length. Although it does resemble sharks, it is certainly not a true shark, and there isn't evidence that it existed 385 million years ago. Rather, it existed from 370 million years ago and onwards, so it's certainly younger than the first trees. Cladosolake also didn't have crucial shark characteristics such as accelerated tooth replacement and enameloid teeth. Besides Archaeopteryx, there is also Watiza. It is another tree-like plant closely related to the previously mentioned Kelmaphyton. This plant also had closely spaced strands that made up the trunk, while the inside was either hollow or had non-woody soft tissue. This plant very much so resembles Kelmaphyton in many ways, but its trunk seemingly doesn't vary in size as much from top to bottom. And the top part was similar for both plants in that Watiza had densely packed photosynthetic branches. However, there was a significant difference in terms of size. One Watiza plant was found to be around 8 meters tall. It was dated back to about 385 million years ago. Prototaxites were also present on Earth around this time, and yet this tree-like plant was about as tall as the tallest Prototaxites. Other tall plants at the time are Pertica, which had a precursor to true large leaves that later evolved. This plant was potentially up to 1 meter tall. During this time, there were no grasses or flowers. What was present on the ground of the forest below the trees were also alien-looking plant species. Zosterophil is a plant that completely lacked leaves and had photosynthetic stems. It was potentially covered by things that looked like spikes. Leclercia was also present. These had a bunch of tiny needles that spiraled up their stems. These are some of the plants that were forming the carpet of the forest floor. They were not that tall. They were typically less than 50 centimeters in height, just like most other plants at that time. However, Leclercia was potentially up to 1 meter in length, not necessarily in height, and that's despite being only 7 millimeters wide. It was capable of achieving that by leaning onto things. Although plants were really starting to take over land back then, and even though so many of them were quite large, when it comes to land animals, there wasn't anything nearly as big. There were no land vertebrates, only arthropods. So with that, there were no mammals, reptiles, dinosaurs, or amphibians. Giganotarbids are spider-looking creatures that are somewhat closely related to spiders, but are not spiders. They couldn't produce webs. These ranged in size from a few millimeters to a few centimeters, and they were likely predators that consumed other arthropods. There were mites around this time. They were also tiny and were decomposers. Pseudoscorpions, so scorpion-like arthropods, but without the stinging tail, were also present. Centipede and millipede-like creatures were also present. These are called myriapods, and their crucial characteristic is that they have many legs. Some of these were either feeding on decaying plant matter or were predators feeding on other arthropods. Early insect relatives were also present around this time, specifically a species called Rhinelia, which is a springtail that was only 1 to 2 millimeters long. At this time, there were likely no fully terrestrial animals a lot larger than 10 centimeters. Partially, the relatively small size of the arthropods could be due to oxygen levels that were either similar to the present day or slightly lower. Oxygen levels can to a degree influence how large arthropods get, but that is not the only factor influencing their size. As far as vertebrates, there is the famous Tiktaalik, a lobe-finned fish that could briefly walk on land but was mostly aquatic, a transitional species that led to land vertebrates. The problem is that this species likely existed around 375 million years ago, so 385 million years ago there likely was no Tiktaalik. But the land wasn't necessarily entirely devoid of species like Tiktaalik, so there were potentially some other ones that had very similar properties, such as wrists with which they could put themselves on land for a bit and move around in mud. With regards to the weather, it's hard to say if there was more or less cloud cover. Potentially there wasn't much in the interior of the continents, and those were maybe very dry, especially when it comes to places far away from all waters, including the rivers and lakes. Humidity there was very low. Coastal areas, on the other hand, were very humid, since they were near a very warm body of water. The Old Red Continent, which was close to the equator, was likely much more humid and more cloudy than the colder and drier Gondwana, which was much closer to the South Pole, and it had a thinner cloud cover. Since most of the land was so close to the South Pole, it had large swings between the summer and winter temperatures, as the daytime and nighttime length was so wildly different between the summer and winter. It is important to note that even at the equator, daytime and nighttime length was different compared to today because the Earth had a day that lasted between 21.5 and 22 hours. So that is what the Earth was like 385 million years ago, a planet with alien forests that only just started to take over the land. Some recognizable plants like trees emerged during this time. There were no land vertebrates, just arthropods that are pretty small. A massive amount of fresh and saltwater fish species were starting to emerge in huge shallow seas and rivers. There were no large ice sheets at the poles, and the entire planet was way warmer than today. Although the planet was very old at this point, many of the species that we know today were just starting to emerge back then.